inspired, fired up and on the move. Yeah, 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 yeah. From all the places and all the races, arm in arm now, upon our feet. Yeah, 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 yeah. From all the schools and all the homes, it's time to take it. It's time to take it to the street.
Gonna get militant up in here. Hello, my friends, and welcome once again to this week's episode of The Call, the program that calls you to educate yourself, educate others, take direct action, advocacy, and help with policy changes or anything that you might want to do to make both your community and our world a better place. And this week, our guest is someone that I found is a very special person and that I'm learning to both know and like. And our guest today is Miriam Ghani, who is a journalist and a videographer. She does documents all over the world, and we're so glad to have her. And we're just going to invite her to introduce herself to all of you and tell you a little bit about herself and the work that she does. Hello, Miriam. Glad to have you.
Hi, Reverend Woodbury. It's nice to be here. I'm Mariam Ghani. I am an artist, a writer, and a filmmaker. I also teach at Bennington College, and I make work that is concerned in many ways with history, but how history operates in the present. So it's concerned with the question of what's available to us from the past and what from the present is going to be available to the future, which I think is actually a pretty urgent set of questions because the past is so important to how we understand the world today. And so much gets written out of history. And I've always been really interested in what it is that gets written out of history and why.
Yes, absolutely. And we're all familiar with the saying that people who do not know their history are doomed to repeat the same mistakes. And as you said, you know, history is not something that is written in stone. It's the story that's told in a certain way by whoever is the teller of that story. You know, there's a story that I like that talks about a deer hunter and a deer. You may have heard it before. And it's about a man who goes out deer hunting one day and he sees a big, magnificent buck with a huge rack of antlers, and he lifts up his shotguns and shoots the buck. The deer falls down and he goes over to capture his prize. And just as he reaches out, the deer jumps up and begins to gorge him with the antlers and then runs away. And so the next day in the human community, the story reads, Hunter ravaged by maddened deer. But in the deer community, the story read, serial killer attacks their serial killer is attacked by a victim.
Yeah.
So it depends on who is telling the story, right? Yeah. And so storytelling is an ancient process, you know, long before we had vocabulary and writing, we told stories. And so what is it about stories that intrigues you? The art of storytelling.
That's an enormous question. I think there's always a struggle over storytelling and who gets to tell the stories. And because I grew up kind of in between cultures, and the cultures I grew up in between were were places that were in the middle of civil wars for most of the time that I was growing up. I was always very aware of how contested the narratives around those places and those histories were, and how there were many, many versions of how those stories were told. And there still are many versions of how the stories of those periods in my parents' countries were told. There's no one fixed history of the Civil War in Lebanon. There's no one fixed history of the communist period and civil war in Afghanistan. There's just many different actors with many different stories. So I think I was always very interested in, in what that meant, and what that meant for how we, understand what it means to be a nation, like Afghanistan or Lebanon, and what that means for how the rest of the world understands places like that, because history is part of how those places get interpreted in the rest of the world. Although quite often nobody even bothers to look at the history when they're planning their present day intervention, right?
Right, absolutely. And I saw that. I'm good. Back in 2001, I was in Durban, South Africa, at the United Nations Conference on Racism and Xenophobia. And every night after attending the conference, I would go back to the hotel, and I would turn on the news, and I would watch the BBC channel. I'd watch the French channel. I'd watch CNN. I'd watch South African news, and depending on where they were historically, they put a different spin, on it. So if they were a former colonial power, they told it a different way from the United States, or the South Africans had a different spin on it. And there were a couple of occasions where I literally sat in a hotel and said to myself, well, what I saw at the conference isn't what any of them are reporting. They all had a different spin on it. So let's talk about storytelling and also visual. So you're also, you've been a journalist, and you also, you do documentaries, you video people. And so that is a different sort of way of telling the story. Why don't we talk about, because let's let our audience know too that your works have and are being shown all around the world. Where are some of the places? The National Gallery in Washington, D.C., Beijing, China, Seoul, Korea. I mean, that's interesting. How has your work been shown in so many different places around the world?
Well, I've been, I would say, lucky, but actually a lot of it is the result of very hard work. So it's always a combination of, tremendous, to succeed as an artist, I think requires the combination of tremendous will, because it's not an easy profession. So you have to want it very badly and have a kind of iron will to carry you through the really terrible early years of the career where you make absolutely no money and have to have a day job and are working all the hours of every day. And then you also have to get a little bit lucky at some point where someone, sees the work and puts it in some kind of show that has some visibility, or puts it in a festival if it's a film that gives it a little bit of visibility, and that can lead you on to other things. But then you also have to do the work of following up on that and building on whatever initial kind of opportunities you get. You just have to keep working and working to build on them, and nobody can do that but you, because it's a very solitary profession in the early years. When it's very DIY, like when you're doing all the things on every project. Like in my early projects, in my very first films, I directed them, I shot them, I edited them, I did all the sound work. I did, I basically did every role on the film was just me. So it's like, I made
But that
quite
was
long
great.
films where, I just did everything myself because I didn't have any budget at all,
Mhm.
that was the only way to make anything. And that was sometimes I was even performing in the films myself as well. So it's like, it really required some kind of, gyrations to get all of that done. So,
Mhm.
it really does it takes a tremendous amount of labor, which I think people don't always associate with the making of art. It's actually a lot of work.
Mhm.
And it's a lot of work in a field where work is unregulated. There's no unions. There's no
Yeah.
one looking out for you and telling you to stop at a certain hour. You just keep going. And also there's the expectation that you work all the time. There's
Mhm.
an expectation that you work on the weekends. There's an expectation that you are working all the time because you're working with people in other time zones. So, there's an expectation that you take a meeting at 9 p.m. or 2 a.m. or 5 a.m. or whatever, So yeah, that's how I managed to do all the things that I've done all over the world, is basically, sheer commitment,
Mhm.
being very nice to people all the time, which I think is important and not mentioned enough.
Mhm.
Always being extremely nice to everyone I work with.
Yes.
And working all the time, taking I've taken maybe one vacation in the last 6 years. So
Wow.
yeah. Yeah.
We'll have to talk about that because you've done some things around health, and it's not healthy to work that much now. You haven't taken.
I know. Yeah, the pandemic was very good for my health in a really bizarre way because it made me slow down. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And that is a really privileged thing to say.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's a reflection of the privilege of being able to work remotely. Yeah.
yes, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a thing, and I have to explain this sometimes to my family members, that when you're doing something that you really love
Yes.
and that you're really passionate about,
Mhm.
you're working, but it doesn't seem like work.
Yeah. It
Is
feeds you. It feeds your
Mhm.
soul to
Yes,
work.
yes, absolutely. Not the same as working for someone else and
Yeah.
for their dreams and their goal. So,
Yeah.
so going to festivals has helped you to get your work out internationally. And let's talk about some of your pieces, like "Water from a Stone." Tell us about that particular piece of work that you've done.
Mm. Yeah, so like Water from a Stone came about as a result of a residency that my collaborator Erin Ellen Kelly and I did in Norway in I think we did the residency in 2013 and finished the piece in 2014.
Mhm.
And that actually came out of a show we were invited to do at a space in Stavanger, which is a really interesting city in Norway that's extremely connected to the undersea oil exploitation that's
Wow.
going on, that is
Mhm.
run by the Norwegian state oil companies. So Stavanger is essentially where one of the pipelines ends. It's where the Museum of Petroleum is located.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's also where people come when they rotate off the oil rigs. So when they have like a 6-week break from the oil rigs, they come to Stavanger. And
Mhm.
so you can imagine what the nightlife there is like. It's real weird. It's real weird.
Weird how I imagine it's a party town, 6 weeks, but weird how.
Yeah, in that it has a kind of intense, frantic quality to it.
Mhm.
As you might imagine, for people who know they only have these 6 weeks of the year where they're not on an oil rig,
Mhm.
and they have to pack so much living into
Mhm.
those 6 weeks
Wow.
that it feels really intense. But yeah, so because we were there in Stavanger and we had been asked to make something about that region for this show we were invited to do, that was a kind of retrospective of other works we had made about other places and the histories that are embedded in their landscapes.
Mm-hmm.
So we did this residency and we started kind of looking into the histories of that landscape in that region, Rogaland, and the neighboring region, Suldal. And we got, of course, very interested in this question of the undersea oil exploitation and how much it had transformed Norway, because that didn't start until the 60s. And, you know, we now think of Norway as being this really wealthy country, and it is. And it is because of the oil exploitation, because it's a state oil company and every Norwegian gets a monthly check from the state oil company.
Wow, monthly check.
A monthly check. They actually, every single Norwegian benefits from the state oil company's projects, not only undersea oil exploitation, but also what they're doing in the tar sands in Canada, in Angola, all the projects that they're doing all over the world. And ironically, Norway is also the country where electric vehicles have been taken up the most of anywhere in the world. Like, they actually don't really, they've really progressed quite far with not using oil themselves. And they also have this marvelous Museum of Petroleum in Stavanger, which really is almost like a monument to shame. I felt it's kind of similar to the Museum of Opium in the Golden Triangle in Thailand, where it's really kind of unpacking all these very complicated feelings Norwegians have around being so beholden to the oil industry, yet recognizing at the same time how many terrible effects it has on the world. But it transformed Norway so enormously. And that's what we really started seeing when we were looking into the histories of the landscape, because Norway is basically like a thin layer of dirt over an enormous rock.
Similar to Japan.
Yeah, so they were incredibly poor for a really, really long time. And also they were a Danish colony for a very, very long time, which is something I hadn't really known that much about. And it was surprising to me how long it had gone on. It went on until almost the end of the 18th century, 19th. It was like well into the 19th century, I think. I might not be right about that. But it was really quite a long time, and they didn't kind of start to construct their own national identity until, you know, the 19th century. And it's all sort of artificially constructed in a weird way, where they invented a folk costume for themselves, and then they invented like national songs, but none of it was handed down from long ago in the way that we think about these things, you know, sort of, or it didn't grow up in a kind of piecemeal fashion in the way that we think about these things normally, kind of growing up over time and then melding into one tradition. One person kind of invented all of it.
Wow,
and then popularized it. Yeah, this one woman basically invented all of the folk costumes and then popularized them, which is so weird. So astonishing, you know?
Wow.
Yeah. So that, yeah. And then I'll just say one more thing about the oil, which is some of the regions we shot in, there were no roads in those places until the late 1960s, early 1970s. Because Norway as a state was so poor, it was the poorest country in Europe. And many of these remote farming, you know, outposts or places where people just kept sheep as their sort of means of living, there were no roads, and people could only get there through these, by boat on these enormous, like through these narrow passages into these big fjords. And then they would have to climb a mountain to get to the place, right? So it really was a huge difference that was made with the oil. Yeah.
Wow, that is extremely interesting, in the fact that there's this dichotomy between the people, where it's like, we know the harms that oil is doing to the planet and
Mhm.
to the climate, and they understand that, hey, they really don't need to be using fossil fuels, for transportation. But then on the other hand, they're benefiting. And when you said Angola, I was like,
Oh
wow.
yeah.
Angola, when you think of Angola, you think of the Portuguese, colonizing them, and the Angolans in Africa, and the benefits that they got. So that's really interesting.
Mhm.
So what was the main theme or takeaway from Water from a Stone?
Well, the title kind of refers to the saying like blood from a stone, about the
Mhm,
difficulty of extraction, right? But
mhm,
we were kind of interested in the way that Norway exists between water and stone, right? And
mhm,
that's the way that people made their living before oil was either, fishing on the North Sea, which is a very dangerous sea, or trying to scrape a kind of subsistence farming existence out of this
mhm,
really, really rocky terrain. There were stories people told us that they remembered from their own childhoods where every spring the fields would push up rocks like
mhm.
with the first frost, like rocks would be pushed up into the fields, and they would, as children, have to go out. It was the children's job to go out and pick all the stones out of the field so that you could plow again without
Wow.
breaking the plow, right? And now, and I actually saw this with my own eyes, they just hire bulldozers to do it. And there's stone walls all over Norway that are made out of these stones that were picked out of the fields every spring. That would just kind of, so the stone walls would get higher and higher. So yes, we were thinking a lot about stone and about water and all these kind of stories, these folk stories in Norway that have to do with spirits of place, that are all about spirits of the water or of stone, in a way, of the fields and stones.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Interesting. And the thing about your films are that they're so different in some ways. So you also did a film about um, people disappearing, you
Right.
know, with immigrants and people just kind of disappearing. And why don't you talk about that, because that is so different from what you just described.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in my work with Erin, it's really, because she's a dancer and a choreographer, it's really using performance to kind of think about landscape, but also with the body try to know a place, right?
Mhm,
And really think about how we know where we are through our bodies. Right?
mhm,
Um, but in Index of the Disappeared, the project you're talking about, that's a really long-term project with another collaborator, Chitra Ganesh, a visual artist. And we've been working on that. It's now 17 years that we've been
wow.
working on that project. Yeah. Yeah, it's a really long time.
Mhm. So
And
tell us some, give us some
mhm,
details about it. 17 years is a
mhm.
really long time. Mhm,
Yeah, so there have been sort of projects within the project, but the overarching uh, goal of Index of the Disappeared and its kind of overall form is an archive. It's an archive of disappearances, detentions, deportations, renditions, and it looks at in archives the difficult histories of immigrants, uh, dissenting communities, and others in the US since 9/11, and also at the effect of post 9/11 American policies abroad.
mhm,
So it really is looking at the kind of extension of imperial US imperial overreach in these years, and the way that then some of those policies boomeranged back into the United States over time. So it really
nice.
started with this kind of post 9/11 phenomenon of detention and deportation that really swept through so many immigrant communities, including communities to which Chitra and I were personally really close, and created these incredible and deeply felt absences in people's lives. And then it really became a project also of looking at how increasing censorship and erasures and redactions in documents were enabling these disappearances of real people.
Right. And certain things that happened because of 9/11 are actually still in place today.
Yes.
So we're talking about Guantanamo Bay. We're talking about people being taken to places like Egypt and other places like that. Just
rendition, yeah.
Yeah,
the black sites, which the CIA black sites have been dismantled, but what happens with like Joint Special Operations Command black sites is much less clear. The drone program, the drone strike program, is definitely a legacy of this time as well. And, at home in the United States, there are two major legacies of this time in terms of policies that were pioneered overseas during the so-called War on Terror and then really came back into US systems. And one is the communications management units in US prisons, like Terre Haute in Indiana and Marion in Illinois, which are these prison units that have extreme limits on communication, basically nothing in or out, which are used, as a even more extreme form of like administrative segregation or SHU, where, not only people can't receive written communication, they can't do phone calls, and they never get any visits with family. So yeah, and it's used to really, to segregate prisoners who come in with some kind of politics attached to them, but it also is used to stop political organizing in prison. So, that's another thing that it's been used for, and it's been used for a lot of Muslim prisoners. And then the other real effect of this is, the increasing securitization and militarization of domestic police forces, and the way that all of this incredibly inappropriate military gear has landed back in domestic police forces. And you see this being used in situations where it's really not needed, and it escalates situations in a way that is really problematic. That police forces all over this country, and including school police, have had access to so much military surplus equipment over the last 10 years through the MRAP program, is terrifying, honestly.
Right. And the average American doesn't realize that when there's surplus military equipment in places like Iraq, that this equipment just doesn't disappear. I mean, some of it is sold to other to military in other countries, but as you said, a lot of it is actually showing up now in our police departments. And it's kind of scary because what exactly are they preparing for, right?
Yeah. If you dress for a war, you get a war. This is one of the things that I always kind of think about. The other thing that I think has not really been explored enough, and I don't have enough documentation on this to really talk about it, but I do think there has been also a circulation of people, into the War on Terror and then back into domestic police departments through National Guard deployment. People being called up from the reserves to serve in military police, which were used in places like Bagram, like Abu Ghraib, and so on, and then came back into domestic police departments and domestic prisons. And I think there's something that happened there as well, but I don't know enough to say what it is exactly.
That's interesting, because I had a conversation with someone who actually served in the military, and we were having a conversation about police shootings, particularly of blacks and brown people, and I said to him, I said, I don't understand why are they responding that way, and his answer was a lot of the police officers that we have actually served,
Yeah.
in the military, and they come back home, and they really don't get debriefed. They really don't take the time to acclimate them back into society. And he said what happens is that when they get into a situation that is threatening to them, that they respond with the military rules of engagement. So if you're in a war, you may not necessarily say to the enemy combatant, stop, put your hands up, but instead you just fire. And so I had not thought about that until he said that. He said, hey, some of these young guys and women that are coming back, they still have that mindset. And so, if they see something that they think may be threatening, it might be a cell phone, they are conditioned to respond, by the rules or the modes of military engagement, rather than, how the procedures that are used for civilian policing. And that's interesting. So it's not only the equipment, but the people who are returning that may have a military mindset that is contributing to a lot of the shootings that we're having in this country, right?
Yeah, but I think we could also dig a little deeper into that and think about why that's the military mindset, right? And why it's okay to just shoot first and ask questions later in a place like Afghanistan or in a place like Iraq, right? Because very often those are also civilians, right? Who are getting shot in a situation like that. And that has to do with colonial settler mentalities and the kind of imperialism that pervades these interventions, right?
Right.
And a hierarchy of human beings, essentially.
Right? And we're not accustomed to thinking of the United States of America. I almost said America, but then I have some friends who who corrected me on occasion, said, oh, so when you say America, do you mean that Mexico and Central America and Canada and South America all belong to your government? Or do you mean the United States of America? But a lot of, for the average American, we don't see America. We know that Britain and France and Spain and Portugal and Germany all have histories of colonialism, but we don't think of the United States in terms of imperialism. We don't think about the United States having colonies, because we don't use the word colonies. We use the word territories to describe American Samoa and
Guam and Puerto Rico.
And the U.S. Virgin Islands, which are actually possessions of the United States of America, though they are not a part of the United States of America. And the people who live there don't have all the rights and privileges. And it's really a form of colonialism.
Yeah, that's completely true. Yeah.
Yeah. So your films actually, that's what I was saying in the beginning. Actually, your films actually educate people, and probably educate people who are activists or people who might become activists, because they get a different view of history than they might have gotten in school. Right?
Yes, I think that's one of the things that I'm trying to do with the work is kind of poke at people's complacency a little, or try to get people to think or see a little bit differently. I do think it's hard for art to make change by itself. And that's why it's important for artists to work with people who are activists all the time, who are 24/7 activists. If you're a 24/7 artist, you can't be an effective activist in the same way that someone who's a 24/7 activist is. And that's where I think the importance of real collaborations around something like a film that can have a kind of visibility that draws attention to an issue in the short term, or in certain contexts among certain people. It can do some work, but then to do the deeper work of real education, of real engagement, of real follow through, you need partnerships. You need other people to help do that work.
And we need arts, and it's art and culture also, along with activism, I believe, that actually drives change. And when you look at it, the history around the world, you can see it in the songs, you can see it in the culture and the way that people, when we look at the civil rights movement in the United States, all you have to do is hear somebody sing the words "We shall overcome," and you know what that song is all about. And I was having a conversation with someone about, and now this may be controversial with some of our artists, but it is what it is. And I always say when we speak truth to power, it means not only power on the opposition side, but sometime among ourselves. But I was talking with someone about the new term, BIPOC, right? Black, Indigenous, people of color. And I said, and I'm not sure where that came from, but historically, people decide collectively what they want to call themselves. And the example I gave was that when Black people were enslaved, they were the N-word, they were colored, we were Negro, and we were Black. And you could kind of see the struggle with like W.E.B. Du Bois, who helped form the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, but also wrote the book, The Souls of Black Folks.
Right.
And so this whole process took place. But when African Americans decided, I'm Black and I want to be proud, it was reflected. I said, hey, there was actually James Brown wrote a national anthem for Black people. Say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. And people wore afros and they put on their dashikis. And so I said all that to say that art and culture, music, dance, all of that is intricately bound with the activism that fuels change in every country. And so it shouldn't be seen as something separate, but like you said, those collaborations, those partnerships are extremely important. And when we don't do it, when we fail to do it, then something else fills the gap. The vacuum gets filled, and sometimes it's by rap songs that are, misogynistic or violent, and it has a lot of negative things. So, the importance of your art and other art, what you do is crucial to activism and to us empowering folks to make change. Yes.
That's really nice of you to say.
It's very true. It's very true. And I'm sure we could find examples all over the world, you know what I mean? Where change is tied up with art, with music, with dance. and all of those things. So you have some work in theaters right now, right?
Yes.
So tell us where people can see your work, where they can view it. What do you have out in theaters, and tell us a little bit about. We talked about the past. Let's talk about now. So
Right. So I have a film called What We Left Unfinished, which I actually shot in 2017, and it first came out in festivals in 2019. And it is, in a sort of heartbreaking way, having its in the middle of its theatrical release in the US right now. It's a film about what filmmakers in Afghanistan went through during the communist period. It's through the story of 5 films that were left unfinished during that time, and the kind of crazy lengths that these filmmakers and other people involved with the films went to keep making art during this time when the government was quite repressive, and also there was a lot of opposition to the work of artists supported by the government on the part of opponents of the regime. So they were really caught between a rock and a hard place, or as we say in Afghanistan, between the tiger and the precipice, which is a more colorful way of saying between a rock and a hard place.
Wow, that's nice. I have to remember that. Go ahead.
Yeah. It's a film made with archival footage that was newly rediscovered and restored during the process of digitizing the Afghan film archive. That's hard to talk about right now because I think we may have lost the archive. I don't know yet, but it does seem that way. We may have either lost access to it temporarily, or
we hope so.
Or it might be worse. I don't know yet, and that's really heartbreaking as well. But these 5 films were rediscovered during the process of this larger digitization project that I was working on with the archive and the National Archive. And the film is in a pretty wide virtual theatrical release in the US now, which means you can watch it through your local theater or just through the kind of Eventive platform. But if you watch it through your local theater, your local movie theater, you'll support your local movie theater as well. And to find out where to watch it, you can go to my distributor's website, Decanalog, DEKANALOG.com, and just click on What We Left Unfinished. You'll get a list of all the local theaters that are playing it, and also a kind of overall link to stream it. So you can just stream it from your house, and there are a few places where it's playing in person as well.
Okay, so for example, if we wanted to show it in Florence, right, and I'll just say, living in the state where we live, we don't get a lot of progressive films, etc. Because I've never seen a Michael Moore film played in any theater, where we live. So what? But I also know that that movie theaters will allow you to, like, for example, if they open at 12, and if you want to show a film in the morning, that you can actually do that. So how would that work?
Yeah, well, you actually also, if you want to bring a screening of the film to your community through a community group or a school, you can contact my educational distributor, Good Docs, and you can actually rent the film from them for a group screening. And it's actually not that expensive. And that's one of the easiest ways to organize a group screening is to work with Good Docs. They're really good at organizing those things. They can also organize online group screenings, and can help you out with organizing that if anyone is interested in that. So I think the easiest way to get the right contact information is to go to the film's website, which is whatweleft.com. And all the information is there under the contact page. And also there's a whole list of educational resources around the film on the film website, discussion guides, a lot of context on Afghan history, on the history of that period, some lists of other films that you might be interested in after you watch the film, and some essays on Afghan cinema written by various people if you get curious about Afghan film after you watch the film, because there's a lot more to Afghan cinema than I covered in my film, which is pretty narrow.
Okay, and are some more of your films available there also?
To look at more of my films, you would go to my website, which is just mariamghani.com, or you can just Google me and you'll find also my Vimeo and everything else. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So we're going to do that. Okay, we're going to figure out which one of your films we're going to do. We're going to see if we can talk with some of our partners, some of the other organizations we work with, and also I'm looking at one of my colleagues, Loretta, and I'm like, oh, we every year, this year will be our 11th annual Creating a Climate for Change conference. And we usually do something just before we open up the conference. And while you were talking, I was like, wow, maybe we should do a film showing. So we usually, oh, she's applauding. And we usually have, a little different now with the pandemic because we rescheduled. We didn't have it last year, but we usually have about 250 people from across the country. So that is something that we can talk about offline. I would love to do that. And I so appreciate your work and what you're doing. So how about, you also teach. So what do you teach?
I teach film and video to college students. I've been at Bennington now for 3 years. And before that, I taught in several different places, including the CUNY, the New York City Public University. I taught at Queens College and at the Graduate Center at CUNY, and I taught at Cooper Union, which, for a long time was one of the only free art schools in the United States. Was an amazing place to teach. And yeah, I've taught a lot of different things over the years of teaching in many different schools as an adjunct, as a non-permanent kind of worker who sort of follows the vagaries of academic trends in order to get work. But I do love teaching film, and I love teaching people how to make things, and how to kind of express their own thoughts and their own visions with the technology that's available right now. But it's not really about the technology, it's about what they want to say and how they can say it. And that's really what that kind of teaching is. It's giving them the tools to express themselves, and also the knowledge, the kind of theoretical and historical knowledge to understand what's already been said in the medium, and how what you make now exists in that kind of field of what's already been done. Yeah.
Now, do you do any short films? And I'm just thinking about that because and it's unfortunate, but it's a reality that we have to deal with. And I'm not talking about trailers or, those sorts of things. But, because we, especially young people, we have so many young people today who view things online, who would rather watch videos than read, and a lot of times doing series, because I have a niece who's involved, Herbie, who's involved in the filmmaking industry. That's what she went to school for, TV and movie production. And one of her Shiro's idols is Issa Rae.
Oh yeah.
Who started off doing these really short films online. So I'm curious, have you ever done any work like that, or all of yours are full length?
No, I've made a lot of shorter films, but mostly like between 3 and 24 minutes, I would say, and kind of more around the 20-minute mark. I made much shorter things when I was younger. Like in my early 20s, I made a lot of videos that were between like 2 and 5 minutes long. And then as I got older, I had more and more to say.
Is that what it is? More and more to say, or or more money and experience?
Well, as part of it's more experience because it is really hard to make long form films and it takes a long time and a lot of sustained attention. But part of it is also, I think when where most of us start out in film and video, we're making work about ourselves and our identities and our family backgrounds, kind of our personal histories are our material because we don't have any other material at that age. And everyone's a narcissist in their late teens and early 20s, right? And also like you don't have anything to work with but yourself, no budget.
Right.
But what happened to me as I got older was I got much more interested in other people's stories than my own, and much more interested in questions of broader patterns and broader structures, and what are the structures and systems that actually determine how individual stories play out, right? And to do that, you need more time. Yeah.
So the future. Okay, I know you're working on a piece now. We both know that folks can look forward to seeing this ease. Well, what else are you thinking about? What are you seeing in the future? What's because folks like us, we're working on the here and now, but then we're also envisioning things for the future. So what is Miriam thinking about for the future? What kind of storytelling do you want to capture? There's so much going on now.
Yeah.
The pandemic, economies shifting, things shifting politically to nationalism and the right, things around racism, the climate, so many things. What's on your mind now?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer right now because of what's going on with Afghanistan. I'm really focused on the present.
Yes.
And there's so much that needs to be done so urgently right now. But I am working on a public art project that I can't really talk about yet, but that will be about language, and in a very different way than Disease is about language, but much more about immigration and diversity as expressed through language, and kind of reminding everyone how beautiful our diversity is, how beautiful our differences make us.
Right.
Which I think is an important reminder in this moment.
Oh yes. In every country, in every culture, they're really, they're really made up. They're really like quilts, like patchworks, so everybody borrows something from someone else, so you can look at Asia and you'll see some things from China or Japan or Korea, and people incorporate it into their culture, and over time they don't even realize, hey, this is something that you got from somewhere else, right? Yeah. And so like I said, I so enjoyed meeting you and us having this conversation, and just we have to, like I said, I want to make sure that folks become more aware of your work. I'm going to try my best to help to make that happen. And, you know, the work that we mostly do is around climate
Mhm.
and around environmental justice. And,
Yes.
you know, that's a subject that you might want to think about, you know,
Yeah.
as we move forward. And so if you gave out some information before, but we're getting ready to close and we want people to be able to connect with your work or connect with you. And so why don't you tell folks in our audience what's the best way that they can, you know, they can connect with your work or connect with you?
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, the easiest way is through my website, mariamghani.com. There's a contact email on there and instructions on how to sign up for my mailing list. You can also follow me on Instagram. My Instagram is actually mostly windows because I mostly post images of windows on my Instagram.
At least you have one. I don't have an Instagram account at all. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I know it's just kind of a thing that started with a project and then it just became a thing. It's just a thing. And I am also on Twitter, but I don't really use my Twitter anymore because Twitter is so toxic. And yeah, those are ways that people can follow me and reach me and find out what I'm up to. The film, What We Left Unfinished, also has its own social media accounts, which are linked from mine. And yeah, that's that. And yeah, that's all of that that's going on. I wanted to try and say something about what people can do for Afghanistan right now, but it's so complicated. The main thing is if you have the bandwidth in your own lives to reach out to your elected representatives and just advocate for more slots for Afghan refugees in this moment and temporary protected status for those refugees. That's the best thing that as Americans you can do in this moment. Yeah.
Well, we will encourage people to do that, and if we can come up with a written piece or something, we'll, you know, draft of a letter or something for people to sign on. And you have my commitment that we will help to share it. Okay.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate that.
Oh, you're welcome. Look, we're all, whether people realize it or not, we're all on this planet together. And what happens to one group of us impacts all of us. And so we have to learn to love and care for each other much more than what we do. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much for being our guest, especially these trying times. You're a trooper. Thank you. We appreciate it. And we thank each and every one of you who have come on and joined us once again on this week's episode of The Call. Remember, this is not just a program, but we're calling you to lift your voice, to educate yourself and someone, to take direct action, to help impact policy, or to advocate for change that will make our world a better place. And so until next week, this time, we'll be looking for you again on The Call.
From all the places